The morning of my mother's funeral, my sister Diane handed me a single sheet of paper and smiled. It was the revised will. My name wasn't in it. Not once. I stood in the driveway of the house I grew up, in the house I had spent 3 years renovating with my own hands, while Diane lived across the country, and I read that document 4 times. Each time, the words rearranged themselves into the same impossible sentence. Everything goes to Diane. The house. The savings account. The investment portfolio. Even the small cedar jewelry box my mother had promised me when I was 9 years old. All of it. Gone. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I had quit my job in marketing 2 years before my mother's diagnosis to come home and take care of her. I drove her to every chemotherapy appointment. I slept in the chair beside her hospital bed more nights than I slept in my own. I paid for the wheelchair ramp out of my own savings. I held her hand when she couldn't remember my name. Diane came home for Christmas that first year, stayed 4 days, and flew back to Phoenix. That was the last time she visited while our mother was alive. And yet, somehow, Diane had everything. I had the paper to prove it. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that the will Diane handed me that morning had been signed just 11 days before our mother died. The original will, the one my mother had written 4 years earlier, had left everything split equally between us. So what happened in those final 11 days? That was the question that would unravel everything. My name is Claire. I'm 47 years old. And I am not the kind of woman who falls apart in driveways. I folded that paper, slid it into my coat pocket, and walked back into the house to help carry casseroles from the neighbor's car. Because that is what I do. I function. I handle things. I keep moving. But inside, something had shifted, the quiet, cold kind of shift that doesn't make noise, the kind that comes before a decision. I was not going to cry. I was not going to confront Diane at the reception with a plate of deviled eggs in my hand. I was not going to give her the satisfaction of watching me break. I was going to find out what really happened. 3 days after the funeral, I was packing up my mother's bedroom when I found it tucked inside the lining of her old sewing basket, the green wicker one she'd had since before I was born. A sealed envelope. My name on the front, in her handwriting. The date was 6 months before she died. I sat on the edge of her bed and held it in both hands for a long time before I opened it. What was inside wasn't money. It wasn't a deed or a legal document. It was a letter. 4 pages, front and back, in my mother's careful cursive. And in the first paragraph she wrote, "Claire, if you're reading this, something went wrong. Something I was afraid might happen." My hands were shaking before I finished the first page. My mother's letter didn't spell everything out. She wrote the way she always spoke, carefully, in layers, never saying more than she needed to. But what she said was enough. She told me she had started to notice things going missing. Small at first, her reading glasses, her phone charger. Then, larger, a savings account statement she couldn't find. A callback from her attorney that she didn't remember scheduling. She wrote, "Diane has been handling more of my paperwork than I realized. I am not sure how much. I am not as sharp as I used to be, and I know it. I don't want to believe what I'm beginning to suspect. But I want you to know what I saw." She gave me 4 specific dates, 4 specific things she had witnessed. I wrote all 4 down on the back of a grocery receipt and put it in my wallet. Then I called a lawyer. The attorney I called was not the one who had drawn up the revised will. That attorney was in Phoenix, Diane's city, not ours. I found that out on day 1 of my investigation, and it was the first domino. My mother had used the same estate attorney, Gerald Whitfield, for 22 years. His office was 12 minutes from our house. She had trusted him completely. The revised will had been executed by a man named Patrick Lurie, whose office was on the 18th floor of a glass tower in downtown Phoenix, and who had never once spoken to my mother in person. It had been done entirely by video call and FedEx. During the final 2 weeks of my mother's life, when she was on a rotating cocktail of pain medication and sleeping 14 hours a day, My new attorney, a woman named Sandra Reeves, who specialized in contested estates, pulled the execution records for the revised will within 48 hours. What she found stopped her mid-sentence. She called me from her car. "Claire," she said, "the witness signatures on this document, 2 of them are required by law. One of them is Diane's neighbor from Phoenix. A woman who has never been to your mother's state, let alone her home. Is that legal?" I asked. "Not under these circumstances." And that's not the part that concerns me most. There was a pause. "The notary stamp," Sandra said, "is from a notary who died 8 months before this document was signed." I sat very still. "So the will is potentially fraudulent," she said. "And we need to move carefully. Very carefully." I did not call Diane. I know that's the first thing people want to do. Pick up the phone. Scream. Demand answers. Let the other person know you know. I didn't do any of that. Because here is what I had already learned in 47 years of being Diane's sister. She was fast. She could construct a story, recalibrate, and make you doubt your own memory in under 3 minutes. She had been doing it since we were children. If I called her now, she would begin rewriting before I had anything solid enough to hold. So instead, I called Gerald Whitfield, my mother's original attorney. He picked up on the second ring. And the first words out of his mouth were, "I've been waiting for you to call." Gerald told me that 6 months before my mother died, Diane had contacted his office on my mother's behalf, requesting that all future correspondence be directed to a new email address. The new email address was 1 letter different from my mother's real one. 1 letter. Gerald had followed the instruction. He'd had no reason not to. And so for 6 months, every letter, every update, every renewal notice that went out from his office never reached my mother. It went to Diane. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have caught it. I didn't. And I am sorry, Claire. I am very, very sorry." I told him I didn't need his apology yet. I needed his files. He overnighted them to me the next morning. What was inside those files answered one question and opened a much darker one. According to Gerald's records, my mother's estate was worth significantly more than any of us had discussed at the funeral. The house, the savings, those we knew about. But there was a third account, a brokerage account opened in 1987 that had been quietly compounding for 36 years. It had never been mentioned. Not to me, not at the reading. Because it had already been transferred. 6 weeks before my mother died. Moved in full to a joint account in Diane's name. The transfer had been authorized with my mother's signature. A signature that Sandra, when she saw it, described in 1 word. "Traced," she said. Have you ever trusted someone who completely betrayed you? Drop it in the comments. I want to stop here for a moment, because I know what some of you might be thinking. You might be thinking, are you sure? Are you sure your sister did this intentionally? Could there be an explanation? I asked myself those same questions, every single one of them. And then I thought about the notary who had been dead for 8 months. The witness who had never left Phoenix. The email address altered by 1 letter. The signature Sandra called traced. And then I thought about my mother's letter. The letter she had hidden inside a sewing basket because she was afraid someone would find it. The word intentionally stopped feeling like a question. I need to tell you something I haven't told anyone. 3 weeks after the funeral, I sat in the parking lot of a grocery store for 45 minutes and could not make myself go inside. Not because I was sad. I was past sad. I was in the specific, airless place that comes after the shock wears off and before you know what to do next. The place where the unfairness of everything becomes so loud you can't hear your own thoughts. I had quit my career. I had spent my savings. I had 3 years of my life poured into a house that now legally belonged to the person who had stolen it. I was 47 years old, living in a rented apartment with a futon and a single shelf of books, and I had nothing to show for any of it except a letter hidden in a sewing basket and the business card of an attorney I wasn't sure I could afford. I sat in that parking lot, and I thought, what if I just don't fight? What if I let her have it and walk away and start completely over? I sat with that thought for a long time. And then I thought about my mother pressing the call button. The one Rosario answered. The one that brought her back into the room. My mother had found a way to call for help, even when she was too tired to fight. I started the car. I went inside. I bought a box of cereal and a legal pad. That night, I made a list. My financial situation was not sustainable. I had received a letter from a property management company, copied to Diane informing me that the property would be evaluated for its highest and best use within 30 days. Diane had hired a property manager before the flowers from the funeral had wilted. Sandra was honest with me. This would not be fast. It would not be cheap. And Diane clearly had access to significant resources to fight it. But, Sandra said, she also made mistakes. And people who make mistakes tend to make more of them when they feel safe. So we let her feel safe, I said. Sandra smiled for the first time. Exactly. I did 3 things in the next 2 weeks that changed everything. First, I moved out of the house without a word to Diane. No argument. No protest. No indication I was doing anything other than accepting my situation. Let her think she had won. Second, I hired Dr. Patricia Yuen, forensic document examiner, 72 court cases as expert witness to analyze the signature on the brokerage transfer. And third, I started calling Diane. Casual calls. Checking in. Being the gracious, grieving sister. Every call, I listened more than I spoke. People who believe they've gotten away with something cannot stop referencing it. They circle it the way a tongue circles a sore tooth. Diane was no exception. By the 3rd phone call, Diane had mentioned the house 4 times. Each time, she framed it slightly differently. First it was, Mom always wanted me to have a stable investment. Then it was, you were never really a financial person, Claire. Then it was, I just think Mom understood that you'd land on your feet, you always do. She was writing the story, revising it in real time, testing which version would stick. I said nothing to challenge any of it. I said, and of course, and you're probably right. And I recorded every call, with Sandra's guidance and full compliance with the laws of our state. Every single one. Dr. Patricia Yuen's report arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I read it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I forgot to drink. Her conclusion, stated with what she described as a high degree of scientific certainty, was that the signature on the brokerage transfer was not consistent with my mother's known handwriting samples across a 30-year span. The pen pressure was wrong. The baseline drift was wrong. The letter formation in the final 4 letters of her last name letters my mother had formed the same way for decades were wrong. And there was one more finding, buried in the appendix. Dr. Yuen had examined the revised will as well. Not just the signatures, but the document itself, the paper, the ink, the printing. The will had been printed on a laser printer. Standard, unremarkable, except that one page, page 3, the page that contained the specific asset distribution, had been printed at a slightly different resolution than the other pages. Different printer. Different time. Inserted. What would you have done in my position? Tell me in the comments. Sandra filed for a formal contest of the will within the week. But before we went to court, she did something I hadn't anticipated. She contacted the state's Financial Crimes Unit. Because what Dr. Yuen's findings described the forged signature on the brokerage transfer, the altered document, the deceased notary that wasn't just a civil matter anymore. That was fraud. Potentially elder financial abuse, which in our state carried its own category of criminal penalties. A detective named Marcus Webb was assigned to the case. He was quiet, methodical, and he had worked financial crimes for 11 years. When I met him, the first thing he said was, "Tell me about the email address." He had already been doing his homework. What Detective Webb uncovered filled a 37-page report that I still have. The altered email address had been active for 8 months. During that time, 17 pieces of correspondence from Gerald Whitfield's office had been redirected to Diane. 3 of those contained account information. 2 contained renewal notices for policies subsequently not renewed. 1 contained the original equal split will, sent as a PDF for my mother's annual review. That PDF had been opened 12 hours after it was received by someone in Phoenix. The brokerage transfer had been initiated 4 days later. There was also a witness. Rosario, my mother's home health aide for the final 5 months, came forward after hearing through the hospice network that a case had been filed. Rosario told Detective Webb that approximately 3 weeks before my mother died, Diane had visited for a weekend. Rosario had been asked to step out of the room twice, both times for extended periods. The second time, Rosario came back earlier than expected because my mother had pressed her call button. She found Diane sitting at the bedside table, with documents spread out in front of her, and a pen in my mother's hand. My mother had looked confused. "We're just taking care of some paperwork," Diane had said. "You can wait outside." Rosario had waited outside. She had been thinking about it ever since. The ally I didn't expect came in the form of Patrick Lurie, the Phoenix attorney, who had executed the revised will. When Detective Webb contacted him, Lurie's first instinct was to protect himself. His second instinct, when Webb laid out what they had, was to cooperate. Lurie confirmed he had never met my mother in person. The video call had been brief, under 20 minutes, and my mother had appeared tired and somewhat disoriented. Diane had been present during the entire call, seated beside her. He had flagged the call internally, made a note about his discomfort. But he had proceeded anyway. That note, that one small, self-protective note, was now evidence. There was a morning, sometime in the 4th month, when I looked at what we had assembled. Spread across my kitchen table, Dr. Yuen's forensic report, the phone recordings, Gerald's files, Detective Webb's preliminary findings, the sworn statement from Rosario, the note Lurie had made to himself, my mother's 2 letters. I stood there in my bathrobe with a cup of coffee and looked at all of it, and something settled in my chest that had not been there before. Not anger, not grief. Something quieter and steadier than either of those. I thought, she never considered that I might be this patient. She knew the Claire who reacted. She did not know the Claire who would spend 4 months building a case, in silence. She had made the mistake that people always make with quiet women. She assumed that quiet meant defeated. I drank my coffee. I put the documents in order. I called Sandra. While the legal machinery moved forward, I kept my silence with Diane. The calls continued. She told me she was planning to list the house with a real estate agent who specialized in premium properties. She told me she was thinking about using the brokerage funds to invest in something meaningful. She mentioned a trip to Europe. She mentioned redecorating. She was spending money she did not yet legally own, and she didn't even know enough to be careful about it. I said, "That sounds wonderful, Diane. I'm sure Mom would want you to be happy." And I made notes after every call. Time, date, direct quotes. Sandra called this phase discovery feeding. The other side discloses more than they intend to when they believe the threat has passed. Diane believed the threat had passed. She had no idea that the woman she thought she had defeated was not the same woman who had stood in a driveway holding a piece of paper. 3 months into the investigation, Sandra filed a motion to freeze the brokerage assets. The motion was granted. Before Sandra filed it, she asked me, "Are you ready for her to know?" I thought about it for exactly 1 second. "Yes," I said. "We have everything we need." Diane called me that evening. For the first time, her voice had an edge. I recognized the edge that appeared when she realized she wasn't going to get her way effortlessly. "Did you know about this?" she asked. "About what?" I said. "Some kind of freeze on Mom's accounts. I'm sure it's just procedural," I said. "These things take time, right?" There was a long silence. "Right," she said finally. She hung up before I did. I sat in my small apartment, and for the first time since the funeral, I let myself smile. If you stay for stories about betrayal, resilience, and justice, subscribe now. The biggest twist is still ahead. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in February. Diane arrived with 2 attorneys, and a composure I recognized immediately she had been practicing. She was dressed carefully, spoke carefully, paused before every answer. She was performing the role of grieving, responsible daughter. I sat across the table from her for the first time since the funeral. She met my eyes exactly once, for less than a second, and then looked away. That told me everything I needed to know about where we actually stood. What Diane's attorneys did not know, because we had not disclosed it yet, as was our legal right, was the second letter. My mother had written too. The one in the sewing basket was for me. General, cautious, written before she knew for certain. The second letter had been mailed. To Gerald Whitfield. Directly, in her own handwriting, sent from the hospital on a day Diane wasn't there, given to a nurse named Helen to post on her behalf. Gerald had received it. He had read it, and because he hadn't known what to do with it, because he'd hoped it wouldn't be necessary, he had locked it in a file and waited. When I asked him for his files, that letter was inside. In that second letter, my mother named Diane directly. She described the weekend visit. The documents. Diane's hand guiding hers. She wrote, "I was too tired to fight her. I am ashamed of that. But I want someone to know the truth. This is the truth." It was witnessed by Helen, the nurse, who was still employed at the hospital and who had kept a copy of her own. When Sandra introduced the second letter into the deposition record, Diane's lead attorney asked for a recess. They were gone for 41 minutes. When they came back, the negotiating position had changed entirely. I watched Diane across the table as her attorney spoke in careful legal language about potential resolutions and expedited settlements. I watched her face move through something I had never once seen on it in 47 years of being her sister. I watched her realize she had lost. Not the negotiation, not the legal argument. She had lost the story. The version of events where she was the responsible one, the practical one, the one their mother had trusted. That version was gone. And all that was left was the truth, in my mother's handwriting, witnessed and dated, and locked in a file for safekeeping. Did you see that twist coming? Let me know in the comments. The civil settlement came first. The revised will was invalidated. The brokerage transfer was reversed. The house, my mother's house, the one I had renovated with my own hands, was returned to the estate for equal division. Diane's attorneys negotiated hard on the penalties. Sandra let them. Because the civil settlement was not the ending. 4 weeks after the civil settlement, Detective Webb called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I had read Dr. Ewan's report, where I had spread out all the documents that morning in my bathrobe. "The DA has accepted the case," he said. "Charges are being filed this week." He listed them methodically, without drama. Elder financial abuse. Forgery. Fraud in the execution of a legal document. "Is there anything else I should know before it's public?" I asked. "Just that it moves quickly from here," he said. "She'll be notified today." I thanked him. I put the phone down. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumph, exactly. What I felt was closer to the specific, quiet relief of putting something very heavy down after carrying it for a long time. I was not in the courtroom when the charges were read. I didn't need to be. I was in Gerald Whitfield's office, signing the final paperwork on my mother's estate as it should have been from the beginning. Gerald had waived his fees. I accepted without arguing, because it was the least he could do. Diane did not go to prison. I want to be honest with you about that, because you deserve the real ending and not just the satisfying one. She accepted a plea agreement. 18 months of supervised probation. Mandatory financial restitution. A permanent record. Her paralegal license in Arizona was revoked pending the outcome of the case. The real estate agent she had hired to list my mother's house dropped her as a client when the charges became public. The Europe trip did not happen. I only know these things because mutual acquaintances told me. I had stopped calling by then. There was nothing left to listen for. Her name, and the details of the case, became part of the public court record. That record is searchable. Anyone who types her name finds it. A neighbor called me once, months later, to say she had seen the listing. She said, I had no idea. She said it the way people say things when they want to know more. I said, I know. Most people didn't. And I left it there. The court record speaks for itself. It doesn't need my help. I think about that sometimes. I think it's enough. I sold the house. Not because I had to, because I chose to. The woman who bought it had just retired and wanted to put in a garden. I walked her through every room and told her which walls I had repainted and which floors I had refinished, and where my mother liked to sit in the afternoon light, the window seat in the front room, facing east, where she could watch the neighborhood wake up. She listened to all of it. When I handed her the keys, I cried. The good kind. The kind that has no emergency in it. What I want you to hear, what I need you to hear, is this. My mother knew. She knew what was happening, and she was not silent. She wrote it down. She called for the nurse. She found a way to tell the truth, even when she was too tired to fight. In her second letter, the one she sent to Gerald, the one that changed everything in that deposition room, she wrote one line I have not been able to forget. She wrote, I know Claire will know what to do. She always did. She trusted me, even at the end, when she could barely hold a pen. I try to be worth that. I went back to work. I started over at 47. I freelance now, consulting work, my own schedule, no one to answer to. I am not the same woman who stood in that driveway, holding a piece of paper. I am quieter now, more deliberate. I don't react before I think. I don't speak before I'm ready. I keep records. I listen more than I talk. I know how to wait. Some people call that coldness. I call it clarity. I earned it. Every last piece of it. And so did she. If you've ever been underestimated and found a way to rise above it, subscribe for more stories like this. Was the punishment fair? Would you have done anything differently? Tell me in the comments.